The year 1856 dawned upon Willow Creek, Ohio, with the customary stoicism of a Midwestern winter. A thick, unyielding blanket of snow had descended upon the landscape, muffling the usual sounds of rural life and casting the small, isolated settlement into a hushed, almost reverent stillness. Willow Creek was not a place accustomed to grand events or sudden deviations from its predictable rhythm. Its days were marked by the turning of seasons, the toil of the land, and the quiet, unwavering faith of its inhabitants. Nestled deep within a valley carved by the eponymous creek, the village comprised little more than a cluster of sturdy log cabins and modest timber-framed houses, a general store that served as the community's nexus, a blacksmith's forge, and a small, unadorned church whose steeple, even in its simplicity, seemed to pierce the leaden sky with a plea for divine watchfulness. The people of Willow Creek were hardy, self-reliant souls, their lives dictated by the unforgiving demands of nature and the close-knit bonds of shared hardship. They knew their neighbors, their histories, and their habits with an intimacy that bordered on prescience, and any deviation from the established order was observed, discussed, and often quietly judged. It was into this steadfast, insular world that Dr. Alistair Finch arrived, not as a stranger, but as a prodigal son returning. He had left Willow Creek nearly 2 decades prior, a restless, inquisitive youth with a mind too sharp and a spirit too questioning for the confines of village life. His journey had taken him to the bustling, gas-lit streets of Philadelphia, where he had pursued the rigorous study of medicine, immersing himself in the burgeoning scientific advancements of the era. He had witnessed groundbreaking surgeries, debated theories of contagion, and embraced the empirical method with the fervor of a convert. Now, at 35, with a neatly trimmed beard, spectacles perched upon a somewhat aquiline nose, and a satchel perpetually at his side, he carried the quiet confidence of a man who believed in logic, reason, and the tangible evidence of the natural world. His return to Willow Creek had been prompted by the failing health of his aging father, the village's previous and far less scientifically inclined physician. Alistair had inherited his father's practice along with the unspoken expectation that he would seamlessly integrate back into the fabric of the community. He had anticipated challenges, certainly, the ingrained superstitions, the resistance to modern medical practices, the slow pace of life. But he had been confident that his knowledge, his calm demeanor, and his genuine desire to serve would eventually win over even the most skeptical of his former neighbors. He had not, however, anticipated the profound, unsettling mystery that would soon grip the very heart of Willow Creek. A mystery that would challenge every tenet of his scientific training and leave him grappling with the inexplicable. The Thorn family, unlike the Finches, were not newcomers to Willow Creek, nor were they old money or particularly prominent. They were, in essence, the very embodiment of the village's quiet, hard-working spirit. Elias Thorn was a man of few words, his hands calloused from years of tilling the stubborn Ohio soil, his face etched with the lines of honest labor and quiet contemplation. His wife, Sarah, was a woman of gentle strength, her eyes holding the warmth of a hearth fire and the resilience of a spring sapling. They had built their small farm on the outskirts of the village, a modest but well-kept homestead that spoke of diligence and simple contentment. Their lives had been marked by the usual joys and sorrows of rural existence, but always with a quiet dignity. They already had 2 healthy sons, robust lads who were quickly growing into their father's boots, and the news of Sarah's 3rd pregnancy had been met with communal delight. Another child was always a blessing, another pair of hands for the farm, another soul to fill the pews on Sunday. The pregnancy had progressed without incident, or at least without any obvious incident. Sarah had experienced the usual morning sickness, the growing discomfort, the anticipation that every expectant mother knew. Dr. Finch, upon his return, had paid his customary visits, his modern instruments and methodical questions a stark contrast. To the elder Finch's more intuitive, homespun approach, he had found Sarah to be in good health, the child developing normally, by all scientific estimations. The day the triplets were born, January 23, 1856, began like any other frigid winter morning. A biting wind whistled through the eaves of the Thorne farmhouse, rattling the window panes and sending shivers down the spines of those within. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth, a familiar aroma that usually brought comfort. But on this particular morning, an undercurrent of unease seemed to permeate the very atmosphere. It wasn't anything tangible, not a storm brewing or a wolf howling. It was a subtle shift, a quiet tension that settled over the farmhouse like an invisible shroud. Sarah's labor had begun shortly after midnight, and by dawn, the two village midwives, Martha and Agnes, were already bustling about, their faces grim with the concentration that only comes from assisting at the threshold of life and death. Dr. Finch had been summoned, his presence a welcome reassurance in a time when complications could swiftly turn tragic. He arrived, his breath misting in the cold air, his medical bag clutched firmly in his gloved hand. What transpired in the hours that followed would forever be etched into the collective memory of Willow Creek, a tale whispered in hushed tones. By the firelight, a riddle that defied explanation. The first unusual sign was the silence. Not the silence of a quiet room, but an unnatural, oppressive stillness that descended upon the birthing chamber. Sarah, usually vocal in her labor, seemed to withdraw into herself, her cries becoming mere whimpers, her body straining with a quiet, almost eerie determination. The midwives exchanged uneasy glances. Martha, a woman whose hands had brought countless children into the world, felt a prickle of apprehension on her skin. Agnes, younger but equally experienced, found herself inexplicably holding her breath, listening for something she couldn't name. Dr. Finch, ever the pragmatist, attributed it to Sarah's stoicism, perhaps a particularly difficult labor. He checked her pulse, listened to the faint thrum of the baby's heart, and found nothing overtly alarming. Yet even his scientific mind registered the peculiar quietude. Then came the first child, a girl. She emerged with surprising swiftness, but instead of the lusty wail that typically heralded a new life, there was only a soft, almost imperceptible gasp. Her eyes, startlingly dark even for a newborn, were open, gazing with an unnerving intensity into the flickering lamplight. Martha gasped, not in joy but in a sudden, involuntary intake of breath. The baby was perfectly formed, healthy in every discernible way, yet her silence, her wide, unblinking stare, sent a shiver down the midwife's spine. Dr. Finch, accustomed to the chaos and noise of a delivery, felt a flicker of surprise. He quickly checked the infant, noting her strong heartbeat and healthy color. "A fine, healthy girl, Sarah," he announced, his voice perhaps a touch too loud in the sudden quiet. Before anyone could fully process the unusual arrival, Sarah's body convulsed again. "Another!" Agnes exclaimed, her voice strained. And indeed, within minutes, a second child was born. Another girl. And again, the same uncanny silence. No cry, no protest. Just that same unnerving stillness, those same wide, dark eyes. This time, the silence was deafening. The air in the room seemed to grow heavy, thick with unspoken questions. Elias, who had been pacing nervously outside the door, heard the sudden cessation of sounds and poked his head in, his face etched with concern. He saw his two new daughters lying side by side, impossibly identical, their tiny chests rising and falling with quiet breaths, their eyes fixed on nothing in particular. A cold dread began to seep into his bones. Dr. Finch, despite his commitment to rational thought, felt a tremor of unease himself. Twins were rare enough in Willow Creek, but two perfectly silent, wide-eyed infants were unprecedented. He tried to rationalize it, perhaps a temporary shock, a slight difficulty in breathing that would soon resolve. He gently stimulated the second baby, but still, no cry. Just the unsettling, unwavering gaze. He was about to voice his concern when Sarah let out a low guttural moan, a sound unlike any he had heard from her before. "There's a third," he murmured, his voice barely audible above the rising wind outside. The third child, another girl, arrived with a final, agonizing push. And just like her sisters, she was born into an unnatural silence, her eyes already open, mirroring the dark, fathomless depths of the other two. Three perfectly formed, impossibly identical infants, lying side by side, their tiny bodies still, their eyes wide and unblinking, absorbing the lamplight without reflection. The room was utterly silent, save for Sarah's ragged breathing and the frantic flutter of the midwives' hearts. Martha dropped the cloth she was holding, her hands trembling. Agnes let out a small, choked sound. Even Dr. Finch, the man of science, felt a cold knot of fear tighten in his stomach. This was beyond anything he had ever encountered, anything he had ever read in his medical texts. The sheer impossible synchronicity of their silence, their identical features, their unnervingly open eyes. It defied every known law of nature, every medical explanation. As spring reluctantly yielded to the burgeoning warmth of summer in Willow Creek, the initial shock surrounding the Thorne triplets began to calcify into something far more insidious, a pervasive, unspoken fear. The village, once a bastion of predictable rhythms, now hummed with a low, disquieting current of apprehension. The macabre mystery, as it was now universally known, had not dissipated with the changing seasons. Instead, it had deepened, its tendrils reaching into every home, every conversation, every quiet moment of reflection. The triplets, named Ilara, Isolde, and Seraphina by their parents, though even Sarah and Elias often struggled to distinguish. Them without the colored ribbons remained an enigma. They grew, certainly, their tiny limbs lengthening, their features softening from the raw newness of infancy into the delicate contours of babyhood. They fed with healthy appetites, slept soundly, and demonstrated all the physical markers of normal development. Yet the silence persisted, an unbroken, unnerving stillness that permeated their very being. Dr. Alistair Finch found himself increasingly isolated in his scientific pursuit of an explanation. His medical bag, once a symbol of hope and healing, now felt like a burden, filled with instruments that offered no answers. He had exhausted every known diagnostic method of his time. He meticulously checked their ears for any sign of deafness, their throats for any obstruction, their neurological responses for any indication of impairment. Each examination yielded the same frustrating result: perfect physiological health. He even attempted rudimentary tests of their cognitive awareness, presenting them with brightly colored objects, speaking to them in varying tones, observing their reactions. They would track the objects with their dark, intelligent eyes, their heads turning in unison, but never a coo, never a gurgle, never the spontaneous babble of a typical infant. Their gaze, always so direct and unblinking, seemed to hold an ancient wisdom, a depth that was profoundly unsettling in such tiny beings. It was as if they understood everything, but chose to communicate nothing. His letters to esteemed colleagues in Philadelphia and Boston, once filled with hopeful inquiries, now carried a tone of increasing desperation. The replies, when they came, were kind but ultimately dismissive, offering theories of rare, undocumented syndromes or suggesting that perhaps the good doctor was simply over-observing, allowing the rural superstitions of Willow Creek to cloud his scientific judgment. One prominent physician even hinted delicately that perhaps the strain of returning to a rustic practice after the intellectual stimulation of the city was affecting Dr. Finch's objectivity. These responses only fueled Alistair's frustration. He knew what he was seeing. He knew the difference between a medical anomaly and something truly inexplicable. This was the latter. The Thorne household, once a picture of quiet domesticity, had become a focal point of the village's anxieties. Sarah, a woman of deep faith and unwavering maternal instinct, found herself caught between fierce love for her daughters and a creeping dread. She would spend hours watching them, cradling them, trying to coax a sound, a smile, a flicker of typical infant responsiveness. Sometimes she would swear she saw a faint, almost imperceptible shift in their expressions, a shared glance between them that spoke of an understanding beyond her reach. She would whisper their names, one by one, watching for any sign of individual recognition, but their eyes, dark and identical, would simply gaze past her, as if focused on something only they could perceive. Elias, a practical man rooted in the tangible world of soil and seasons, struggled even more profoundly. He loved his children, but their silence and the unsettling synchronicity of their movements began to chip away at his composure. He would come in from the fields, his shoulders heavy, and find them lying in their shared crib, their eyes open, watching the dust motes dance in the sunlight, their tiny hands occasionally reaching out in perfect unison as if grasping at unseen threads. He started spending more time in the fields, seeking solace in the predictable rhythm of manual labor, away from the unnerving quiet of his home. The older Thorne boys, Thomas and Samuel, once boisterous and curious, now approached their baby, sisters with a mixture of awe and trepidation. They would peer into the crib, their youthful faces etched with a bewilderment that mirrored their parents. "Why don't they ever cry, Mama?" Thomas, the elder, would ask, his voice hushed. Sarah would offer vague, comforting words, but the question hung in the air, unanswered and unanswerable. The children of Willow Creek, usually drawn to the novelty of new babies, now gave the Thorne farm a wide berth, their games of tag and hide-and-seek never venturing too close to the silent house on the hill. The adults, meanwhile, continued their hushed conversations. The general store, usually a place for boisterous trade and communal gossip, became a forum for whispered theories. Old Man Hemlock, the self-appointed prophet of doom, held court by the pot-bellied stove, his voice raspy with conviction. "They are not of this world," he would declare, his eyes gleaming with a disturbing satisfaction. silent, watchful. They are sent to witness, to judge. Others spoke of changelings, of spirits, of ancient curses invoked by forgotten transgressions. The church, usually a source of comfort and reason, now saw its sermons subtly shift. The Reverend Jeremiah Thorne, a distant cousin of Elias, increasingly emphasizing the mysteries of God's will and the unseen forces that shaped human destiny. He dared not speak of the triplets directly, but his parishioners understood the unspoken reference. One sweltering afternoon in late July, a small incident occurred that further solidified the village's growing dread. Young Lily Mae Jenkins, a curious and somewhat mischievous girl of 7, had dared to venture close to the Thorne farm, egged on by a dare from her older brother. Peeking through a gap in the wooden fence, she saw Sarah Thorne sitting on the porch, holding one of the triplets, while the other 2 lay in a wicker basket beside her. Lily Mae, emboldened by curiosity, crept closer. As she watched, Sarah gently placed the baby she was holding into the basket with her sisters. Instantly, all 3 infants, who had been lying still, turned their heads in perfect synchronicity, their dark eyes fixing on Lily Mae through the slats of the fence. No sound, no cry, just that unnerving, unified gaze. Lily Mae, frozen in place, felt a cold dread seep into her small body. It wasn't the look of a curious baby. It was the look of something ancient, something knowing, something that saw right through her. She let out a small, terrified whimper and fled, tearing through the fields back to her home, sobbing hysterically. Her parents, alarmed, tried to soothe her, but her description of the triplets' seeing eyes and their silent knowing only deepened the collective unease. Dr. Finch, upon hearing the account, tried to dismiss it as a child's overactive imagination. But even he couldn't shake the image of those unnervingly intelligent eyes. As the triplets approached their first birthday, their physical development continued apace. They began to crawl, not with the clumsy, exploratory movements of typical babies, but with a fluid, almost graceful coordination. When one began to move, the others would follow, their tiny bodies mirroring each other's actions with uncanny precision. They would explore their surroundings in perfect unison, their hands reaching for the same object, their heads turning to observe the same phenomenon. It was as if they were extensions of a single entity, bound by an invisible, unbreakable thread. Sarah tried to encourage individual play, offering different toys, speaking to them separately, but their attention remained collectively focused. If she held Ilara, Isolde and Serafina would watch with an intensity that made her feel observed. If she tried to engage Isolde, Ilara and Serafina would turn their heads in perfect synchronicity, their dark eyes fixed on the interaction. Dr. Finch, in his continued observations, began to notice subtle patterns in their silent communication. Though they never made a sound, they seemed to communicate through a series of minute gestures, almost imperceptible shifts in their posture, the angle of their heads, the precise movement of their eyes. He would watch them for hours, trying to decipher this silent language, but it remained elusive, a complex ballet of unspoken understanding. He even tried to introduce simple sounds, ringing a small bell, shaking a rattle, but their reaction was always the same, a unified, unblinking stare, as if they were processing the sound, understanding its implications, but choosing not to acknowledge it in any conventional way. Their lack of vocalization was not a deficit, it was a choice, a profound, unsettling silence that seemed to emanate from a place beyond human comprehension. The village's growing fear began to manifest in more tangible ways. Farmers, usually eager to lend a hand, found excuses to avoid the Thorn farm. The general store owner, a kindly man named Mr. Abernathy, would serve Elias and Sarah with an awkward politeness, his eyes darting to the door as if expecting the silent trio to appear. Even the church attendants, usually robust, saw a slight decline, as some parishioners found the Reverend's increasingly veiled sermons about unseen forces too close for comfort. The children, influenced by their parents' anxieties, would point and whisper if the Thorn family was seen in the distance, their innocent faces contorted with a mixture of fear and morbid fascination. The passage of time, which usually brought understanding and familiarity, only served to deepen the enigma of the Thorn triplets in Willow Creek. As Ilara, Isolde, and Serafina transitioned from infancy into toddlerhood, their peculiar silence remained unbroken, a profound and unsettling void in a world accustomed to the babble and cries of young children. By their second birthday, their physical development was remarkable. They were robust, agile, and possessed an almost ethereal grace in their movements. Yet it was the nature of these movements and the eerie synchronicity that governed them, which truly began to unnerve the dwindling number of villagers still willing to venture near the Thorn farm. Their first steps were not the hesitant, wobbly attempts of a single child, but a perfectly coordinated ballet. One afternoon, Sarah, weary from a day of chores, watched in stunned silence as all three girls, standing side by side in their shared playpen, simultaneously pushed themselves upright, took a unified, deliberate step forward, and then another, their tiny legs moving in perfect, mirrored rhythm. There was no falling, no clumsy tumbles, no individual triumphs or frustrations. They simply walked, together, across the small enclosure, their dark eyes fixed on some unseen point beyond the wooden slats. It was less an act of learning, and more a revelation of an innate, shared ability. Their interactions with objects were equally disconcerting. If one reached for a wooden block, the other's hands would extend in precisely the same manner, their fingers closing around identical blocks with uncanny precision. They would stack them, not in individual towers, but often in a single, perfectly aligned column, each girl placing her block on top of the previous one with a seamless, unspoken agreement. When presented with toys, they rarely engaged in individual play. Instead, they would arrange them in intricate, symmetrical patterns on the floor, their movements fluid and coordinated, their small faces devoid of the usual childish delight or frustration, only a quiet, intense concentration. It was as if they were engaged in a perpetual, silent ritual, a game whose rules were known only to them. Dr. Alistair Finch, now 2 years into his self-imposed scientific vigil, found himself increasingly haunted by their presence. His study, once a sanctuary of reason, had become a chamber of unanswered questions. His medical journals lay open, their pages filled with his meticulous observations, but the data refused to coalesce into any recognizable pattern. He had tried every test, every theory, every hypothesis he could conceive. He had even resorted to observing them through a small spyglass from a distance, hoping to catch some unguarded moment, some spontaneous individual action that would break the spell of their unity. But there was none. He spent hours trying to decipher their silent language. He noticed that a subtle tilt of Ilara's head might be followed by Isolde's hand reaching out, and Serafina's eyes focusing intently on a specific object. A slight shift in Serafina's posture could precede a unified turn of all three bodies. It was a complex, nuanced system of nonverbal cues, a ballet of micro-expressions and synchronized gestures that spoke volumes to each other, but remained utterly impenetrable to Alistair. He tried to mimic their gestures, to engage them in this silent dialogue, but they would simply stare at him, their identical gazes unwavering, as if he were a clumsy, uncomprehending outsider attempting to join a sacred rite. The profound intelligence in their eyes was undeniable, yet it was an intelligence that operated on a plane entirely separate from the spoken word, from human communication as he knew it. The village's fear, once a whisper, had now become a palpable presence. The Thorn Farm was effectively quarantined, not by official decree, but by the pervasive dread that kept neighbors at bay. The once frequent visits from well-meaning women bearing pies and casseroles had ceased entirely. If Elias or Sarah ventured into the general store, conversations would abruptly halt, and eyes would drop to the floor. Mr. Abernathy, the store owner, would serve them with a strained politeness, his hands trembling slightly as he weighed out flour or sugar. He no longer made small talk. The silence that followed the Thorns' departure was thick with unspoken anxieties. Old Man Hemlock, his pronouncements growing bolder with each passing month, had become the unofficial voice of the village's collective terror. He held court, nightly by the church steps, his gaunt finger pointing towards the distant Thorn Farm. "They are the Watchers," he would croak, his voice raspy with conviction. "Sent to observe our sins, to mark our transgressions. Their silence is a judgment, a prelude to the reckoning." He spoke of ancient evils, of spirits that stole the voices of children, of a darkness that had settled upon Willow Creek. His words, once dismissed as the ramblings of a senile old man, now found fertile ground in the fearful hearts of the villagers. The Reverend Jeremiah Thorne, though still cautious in his public sermons, began to incorporate more explicit references to spiritual warfare and the need for communal repentance. He organized special prayer meetings, ostensibly for the general welfare of the community, but everyone knew the true object of their fervent pleas. One particularly chilling incident occurred during the summer harvest. Elias Thorne, desperate for help with his fields, had managed to convince a young farmhand from a neighboring county, a strapping lad named Jedediah, to assist him for a few days. Jedediah, new to Willow Creek, was initially dismissive of the local superstitions. "Just silent babes, Mr. Thorne," he'd scoffed. "Nothing to fear." But on his second day, as he was resting near the farmhouse, he saw the triplets playing in the yard. They were gathered around a small fallen bird's nest, their heads bowed in unison. Suddenly, all three raised their heads, their dark eyes, fixing on Jedediah with that unnerving intensity. He swore later, his face pale and sweating, that he felt a cold, unseen hand grip his heart. He didn't hear a sound, but he felt an overwhelming, crushing weight of observation, as if his very soul was being laid bare. He dropped his tools and fled, never looking back, his terrified account solidifying the village's conviction that the triplets were indeed something unnatural. The emotional toll on Sarah and Elias was immense. Sarah, once a vibrant woman, had grown gaunt, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion and a profound sadness. She loved her daughters with a fierce, protective love, but their unyielding silence, their collective, unreadable gaze, created an invisible wall between them. She would sing to them, read to them from the family Bible, tell them stories. But there was never a response, never a smile directed solely at her, never a moment of individual connection. It was as if her maternal affection was absorbed into a shared collective consciousness that acknowledged her presence, but did not reciprocate in any humanly recognizable way. She found herself increasingly withdrawn, her days consumed by the endless, silent care of her children, her nights plagued by unsettling dreams. Elias, a man whose strength lay in his connection to the earth, felt increasingly adrift. The farm, once his solace, now felt like a prison. He worked from dawn till dusk, pushing himself to the point of exhaustion, anything to escape the silent house. He would often find himself staring at his daughters, his heart a knot of conflicting emotions. He saw their healthy bodies, their intelligent eyes, and knew they were his flesh and blood. Yet he also felt the chilling presence of something alien, something that defied his understanding of family, of childhood, of life itself. He began to drink heavily, seeking a temporary oblivion from the constant, unspoken dread that permeated his home. The older boys, Thomas and Samuel, once their parents' comfort, now found themselves caught in the cross-currents of fear and bewilderment. They loved their sisters, but their innocence was slowly being eroded by the village's whispers and their own unsettling observations. They started spending more time away from the farm, seeking the company of other children, though even their friends now regarded them with a wary distance. Dr. Finch, despite the mounting evidence against a purely scientific explanation, refused to yield. He felt a desperate need to prove that reason could prevail, that there was no phenomenon, however macabre, that could not ultimately be understood through rigorous observation and logical deduction. He began to experiment with sound, bringing various instruments to the Thorne farm, a tuning fork, a small drum, even a crude phonograph he had acquired from a traveling salesman. He would produce loud, startling noises, then soft, soothing melodies, observing the triplets' reactions. Their responses were always the same. A unified turn of their heads, their eyes fixing on the source of the sound, processing it, but never reacting with a cry of alarm, a startled jump, or a joyful gurgle. It was as if they heard everything, understood everything, but chose not to acknowledge it in any conventional way. Their silence was not a deficit of hearing or vocalization. It was an active, deliberate choice. One evening, after another fruitless day of observation, Alistair sat in his study, the flickering lamplight casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. He picked up an old, leather-bound book, a treatise on ancient philosophy he had acquired years ago. His eyes fell upon a passage discussing the concept of a collective consciousness, of beings so deeply connected that individual thought became subsumed into a greater, shared mind. He scoffed, dismissing it as archaic mysticism. 5 years had passed since the silent birth of Alara, Isolde, and Seraphina Thorne, and Willow Creek had been irrevocably altered. The initial shock had calcified into a pervasive, unspoken fear, effectively quarantining the Thorne farm. Elias, broken by isolation, sought solace in drink, while Sarah, though fiercely protective, was a shadow of her former self, her maternal love warring with a deep-seated dread. Dr. Alistair Finch, consumed by his scientific vigil, had exhausted conventional explanations. He observed the triplets' uncanny synchronicity in movement and play, their profound, unblinking gaze, and their impenetrable silent communication. He noted subtle, almost imperceptible influences they seemed to exert on their surroundings. A flickering lamp brightening, a draft ceasing, objects shifting minutely. He began to theorize a collective consciousness, a single mind distributed, across 3 bodies, communicating through an unseen network. This chilling hypothesis gained terrifying weight. One afternoon, young Lily Mae Jenkins, daring to peek at the farm, witnessed the triplets' unified, unnerving gaze, feeling an overwhelming, crushing weight of observation that sent her fleeing. Later, the elderly Mrs. Gable, hidden behind a hedge, saw a small injured bird fall. The triplets, with their dark eyes fixed on it, caused its broken wing to impossibly mend, and it flew away. Alistair, piecing together Mrs. Gable's terrified, feverish account, felt his scientific framework buckle. He began to explore esoteric texts, considering ancient concepts of dream weavers and mind walkers, driven by a desperate need to comprehend what his instruments could not. He knew his colleagues would dismiss him as eccentric, but he no longer cared. The macabre mystery was challenging his very understanding of the natural world, and he resolved to seek direct interaction. On a cold, gray morning, Alistair ventured to the Thorn farm, his mind prepared for an unconventional encounter. He sat before the triplets, mirroring their posture, and extended an open hand. In perfect unison, they extended their own. Then, a profound and terrifying sensation washed over Alistair's mind. A torrent of unfiltered thoughts, images, and feelings from his own life, as if his entire being were being scanned and comprehended. He knew they had entered his mind. In the days that followed, the triplets' subtle influences escalated. Objects moved with greater frequency and less subtlety. A book sliding from a shelf, a teacup levitating. Sarah grew more withdrawn, while Elias retreated further into drink. The village's fear erupted into outright accusations. Old Man Hemlock, now a fervent zealot, openly declared the triplets abominations, demanding action. The Reverend Jeremiah Thorne, under immense pressure, began to subtly endorse calls for cleansing. Alistair, despite the escalating danger, felt a strange exhilaration. He brought a small, intricately carved wooden bird to the triplets, silently willing it to fly. Their eyes fixed on it, and the wooden bird impossibly trembled, lifted, and flew a small, erratic circle before gently descending. Their power was growing, extending even to localized weather patterns, a sudden, inexplicable warm breeze, a patch of sunlight piercing heavy clouds. The implications were staggering. If their collective consciousness could influence the physical world, what were its limits? He felt a chilling premonition. The macabre mystery was approaching its climax. News of the triplets controlling the elements ignited the village's fury, culminating in a meeting and a decision for direct confrontation. As dusk settled, the rhythmic chanting of Old Man Hemlock and the fearful cries of the villagers echoed through the valley. A mob, armed with pitchforks and axes, surged towards the Thorn farmhouse. Alistair stood in the doorway, a defiant figure, his pleas for reason swallowed by the mob's cries of "Witch! Demon spawn!" Behind him, Sarah clutched her sons, terrified. The triplets stood motionless, their dark eyes fixed on the approaching chaos. As the first farmer lunged with a pitchfork, an unseen tremor ran through the air, twisting the weapon and wrenching his arm. When others slammed against the door, its iron latch glowed incandescently, searing their hands. Old Man Hemlock shrieked, but the mob faltered. Then a shattered window pane miraculously reformed itself, and an axe aimed at the door melted into a shimmering puddle. The ground beneath the villagers trembled, and their torches extinguished, plunging the scene into darkness. The mob, consumed by terror, dissolved into a chaotic rout, scattering into the night. Alistair watched them flee, a profound weariness mixed with quiet triumph. He turned back to the triplets, who stood serene, their ethereal glow dimming. He knelt before them, sensing a soft hum of acknowledgement. They had defended themselves not with violence, but with an effortless manipulation of reality. They were not evil, but powerful, utterly beyond human understanding. Willow Creek was forever marked. The Thorn Farm became a forbidden zone. Alistair Finch remained, the sole witness, dedicating his life to understanding their silent world. He discovered they communicated through subtle shifts in ambient energy, influencing warmth, light, and even the microclimate around the farm, causing flowers to bloom out of season and crops to yield impossible abundance. He theorized they were an evolutionary leap, a glimpse into a future where consciousness transcended individual thought and spoken language. He never shared these theories, his journals becoming the silent record of a truth too profound for the world. Alistair grew old, his mind sharp, forever engaged in silent dialogue. The triplets never aged, remaining in their youthful forms, their dark eyes holding the same ancient intelligence. When Alistair passed, the Thorn Farm was plunged into a deeper silence. The macabre mystery of the triplets remained unsolved. To the outside world, a chilling legend. But for Alistair, it was a living phenomenon, a testament to unseen threads weaving reality, a reminder that some mysteries are not meant to be explained, but simply to be witnessed. The silent, watchful eyes of Alara, Isolde, and Seraphina continued to gaze upon Willow Creek, a timeless enigma.